we're all built to take care of our bodies. We all have good intuition about our bodies. We have a lot of noise right now that makes it confusing for us to suddenly not be sure if we're taking care of our bodies right, but it's all there. So if we go back to what we're trying to accomplish here, why are we doing this? Well, every time you train, you engage in some type of muscle protein breakdown. That's fundamental. It's actually literally part of the point of training is to damage the muscles and then build them back stronger. So we want to be able to experience that muscle breakdown and then recover from it.
Welcome to the Shakeout Podcast. I'm your host, John Gay. This week on the show, I'm joined by registered dietitian and leading sports nutritionist Jennifer Sygo. As many of our listeners prepare for spring competition plans and seek to maximize their performance, Jennifer joins the show to share her expertise on using food as fuel, drawing on over 20 years of experience as a registered dietitian, including stints as the chief sports nutritionist for Canadian Olympic track and field teams. Whether you're aiming for the top of the podium or simply seeking to get the most out of yourself in your daily exercise routine, Jen is here to provide tangible advice to enhance performance and overall wellness through nutrition. Jen, welcome back to the Shakeout Podcast.
John, it's so nice to see you again.
Yeah, so great to see you. It's fun to catch up in this capacity again. For those of our listeners who maybe don't know, we've shared some national team experiences together. Jen has carried me and many other Canadian Olympic athletes through pretty challenging conditions, whether it be extreme heat or extreme timing
Extreme
of competition,
COVID.
extreme COVID. That's right. We've been through the ringer together, and I, in a personal capacity, am always just so excited to hear what's new in the world of sports nutrition. You're a leading expert, not just in this country, but globally. And it's so valuable for me as an athlete to hear this. And I know that our listeners share that curiosity and that interest in what's going on. So maybe for those who don't have a whole lot of background on what a registered dietitian working in sports nutrition does, you can just give us a little bit of a rundown of what your job looks like.
Oh, sure. Yeah, thanks. And thanks so much for having me. I'm excited to be here and talking about one of my favorite sports. And just as a quick aside, I'm also preparing for my own spring race, which will not be fast. but I very much relate to this time of year and the sort of content that your listeners are looking for. But if my role as a dietitian, not as a average to below average runner, is basically that you in dietitians and sport nutrition can operate in two capacities. One is they might work one-on-one with a client, so you might hire a dietitian or have benefits that would cover you going to see them professionally, whether that's virtually or in person. And in those cases, they would do an assessment and they would learn about your background and not just your everyday background, but your sports specific background. And then they would create a plan that works for you that would be customized. And that's the key part, is that it's meant to be specific to your needs, specific to your preferences, to your day, your schedule, all of that, as well as your goals. You know, how competitive are you in your sport? How much do you want to push the envelope, so to speak? Or are you just looking for some general guidelines and tips? And that's all part of the consideration. The second hat that some dietitians wear, and that I've been fortunate to wear for over 10 years now, is working in the high performance sport environment, where you're actually part of the athletes working in what we call the DTE, or daily training environment. And in that space, you come in and you actually are there with the intention of supporting elite athletes who are training for some type of optimal performance, whether that's a first ever national championships, or maybe an Olympics, or maybe a podium. And your job is to help them narrow that gap to that, whatever that personal best performance is, and eking out every little, microsecond or centimeter, millimeter that you can in that athlete's performance. And that's a really exciting part of the job that I've enjoyed tremendously.
Yeah, no kidding. And has been of so much value to so many countless Canadian national team members, Canadian Olympians. Jen, what are some of your guiding principles when it comes to your approach to working with athletes, whether that be high performance athletes or just people, as you mentioned, looking to incorporate nutrition into their daily fitness routine, into just general wellness and health?
Well, I appreciate you asking that, because I think, these days with nutrition, there's so much, it's so intense sometimes. People come in and they want to know, what's the latest superfood, or what, should I be doing this sort of, really, really out there diet, or should I be restricting this whole category of foods? And I'm very open to those conversations. There's no topic that's off limits for me. I don't want my clients or the athletes that I work with to feel that they're going to get the same recommendation from me no matter what. However, there are these guiding principles that we use as dietitians, as nutrition professionals, with pretty much every athlete as a starting point. And so you start there, and then you sort of, if there is customization that really gets into the outer realms and reaches of nutrition, great. But I want them to have tried to work with the fundamentals first and master those before we get fancy. And endurance training, you could say the exact same thing, is like, oh, I should be doing this much zone 2, or, how am I, should I had an athlete ask me about altitude training the other day, and I'm like, well, hang on a second, let's get our basics first, and then we'll play around with all the extremes. So the basics that I believe in, and if you're training for anything this spring, is start here. No matter whether we're talking, your first 5K or you're really working towards an elite marathon, is we want to start with good meal timing. And I know it's a tried and true concept, but it's hearing it is one thing, doing it is the other. So when you're
Right.
listening to this right now, I want you to visualize your actual day, not just say, yep, I've heard this before, but are you eating regularly throughout the day? I have a rough rule that I give the athletes I work with, which is no more than 4 hours without eating. So we want to go and look at our day and look at the where the times are in our day where there might be problems. So it could be a long commute, it could be a chunk of meetings in the afternoon, or it could be a training session. And that's a big one for some athletes. As I say, if you've got even a 4-hour window from pre to post training where you're not able to fuel, then we want to plan to have a meal or a snack. Obviously, during training, it would be a snack, but the rest of the day, it might be a meal that breaks up those intervals. And the second rule I give the athletes I work with, and I use the word rule lightly, guideline, is to include both protein and carbs or carbohydrates at each of those meals or snacks. So and the one exception being during training, when we would mostly go to just a carbohydrate food because of its digestibility and the quick energy it gives us. And the rationale for that is that the protein is what helps build muscle, but it really importantly also helps us to feel satiated, so we're not hungry all day. And we know the more you're ramping up training, the hungrier we get. And sometimes people, that confuses them. It's like, I feel like I need to eat all day. It's like, well, yeah, you're doing big miles, so you're
Yeah.
going to be more hungry. So protein helps to curb that appetite effect. And then carbohydrates break down into glucose, which is sugar, and that's what fuels our performance. That's what builds up muscle glycogen. That's the gas in our tank. And that's also what gives us blood sugar fuel, which is fuel immediately for our brain to think, as well as, once again, for our muscles to use for energy. So it's the combination of those two that we want to balance throughout the day. Like I said, roughly no more than 4 hours between those meals and snacks, unless you follow a particular fasting protocol. So that's where I start.
Yeah, I mean, when you spell it out like that, it makes it sound so simple. Just make sure you're eating often, make sure you're getting carbohydrates, make sure you're getting proteins in. Check, check, check. I think a lot of listeners are shocked to hear it described in such simple terms. You talk about the just a number of different nutrition products, nutrition plans out there, and there is so much chatter, there's so much noise. It's, I think, so easy to get lost in the weeds talking about something that at its fundamental level is just inherent to existence. Food is fuel, like you say. It's the what we need to stay alive, and I think so many of us have a tendency to overcomplicate it at times. But what you're saying, from what I understand, is this strategy really applies no matter what level of athlete you are. I love the analogy you use of gas in the tank. Maybe you could speak a little bit more on that.
Sure, yeah. And so again, I know you're saying these are simple terms, and remember, we're all built to take care of our bodies. We all have good intuition about our bodies. We have a lot of noise right now that makes it confusing for us to suddenly not be sure if we're taking care of our bodies, right? But it's all there. So if we go back to what we're trying to accomplish here, why are we doing this? Why am I saying eat regularly? The point of this is that every time you train, you engage in some type of muscle protein breakdown. That's fundamental. It's actually literally part of the point of training, is to damage the muscles and then build them back stronger, especially if you do resistance training, which I hope lots of people do, because that does help not just with the running, but overall with things like building strong bones and making sure that our muscles are strong enough to handle the training that we're doing. So we want to be able to to experience that muscle breakdown and then recover from it. Now, that recovery window takes a good, easily 2 days. In fact, when you talk about extreme bouts of activity, you can see signs of muscle damage even a week after the activity is completed. So for a regular workout, you're looking at about a 48-hour recovery window. Well,
Wow.
bad news, you're going to train again in less than
Yeah.
48 hours. So what do? Likewise, that's the muscle protein side of things. The carbohydrate side of things, that glycogen in the muscle, if you're doing big speed intervals, speed workout training, you're going to just demolish your glycogen stores. So by the end of, say, 4 all-out 400-meter sprints, which, to be fair, no one's going to do all-out race pace, but you can basically take your glycogen down to full depletion in that time. We often
Wow.
hear about glycogen taking 2 hours to fully deplete, but that's at steady state 70%. If you're doing something all out or you're doing a lot of high intensity interval training, those glycogen stores are going to be really, really low. Or if you're not eating many carbohydrates, which is a huge trend these days, you're also going to have low glycogen levels. So those things in concert mean that when you finish a workout, especially if it's long, especially if it's intense, or especially if it really was something that had a lot of, like I said, a lot of duration combined with intensity in it, then all of a sudden you both have that muscle damage and you have that glycogen loss. The way to recover both of those is to eat frequently.
Mm-hmm.
So if all you do is eat once, or let's say what a lot of runners do, which is come home at night and not eat anything because they've heard they shouldn't eat before they go to bed, then you've compromised that recovery process. So now you go into tomorrow's workout already with something missing. And then you wonder why after day 3, 4, 5, you're suddenly starting to feel depleted. You're starting to feel like, man, I just don't have anything. Where's that gas in the tank? And then the quality of the workout is compromised. And no matter what level you are when you're listening to this, you want to perform your best out there. If you're going to put the time into all of those workouts, why waste it? And so
Yeah.
this is why that meal frequency is important. It's not just a random thing. It makes you feel better too, but it is part of the mechanism of the muscle recovering and the body recovering. And then you're feeding forward into the next workout.
Feeding forward is a really nice alliteration to make it all make sense. You talk about the timing of the meals, eating frequently throughout the day. You also touch on something that I wanted to go into a little bit more depth on, and that is that post-workout recovery, particularly in the evenings. I know a lot of our listeners probably work full-time jobs, they get a workout in, they come home, and sometimes almost counterintuitively, they don't have that appetite after a really hard
Yeah.
session. It
Yep.
almost has made them averse to wanting to eat. What are some strategies that they can use to make sure that they're fueling forward, like you say, recovering the day of, but also investing in the next day's workout and the day after that's workout?
Yeah, so this is critical, and you hitting on the appetite thing is such a great question coming from an experienced runner like yourself, because one of the interesting things is that when you do heavier intensity work, so anything that's really building up a lot of lactate or a lot of, as we would say, a lot of acidity in the muscle, there's a whole debate about how we should talk about the term lactic acid versus lactate, and for the scientists out there who may be listening, they'll say it's not the lactate that's causing the burn, it's the hydrogen that's reducing the pH of the muscle and making it acidic, which makes it burn. Okay, let's get past that. The point is, when you have a lot of lactate that's building up in your muscle, which happens when you're doing anything above threshold, which means breathing really hard, things feeling really intense, getting that burn, or doing that either for like in a really an intense longer run or a bunch of short burst intervals, it actually acts as an appetite suppressant. So one of the biggest challenges I had working with the national team is that I'd be working with athletes, especially in that sort of 400 to 800 meter athlete kind of breadth or stretch, and also the 1500 meter runners from time to time as well. They do so much work in that lactic acid space that they end up with that constant appetite suppression. And I would do presentations and I'd ask all the athletes, the 100 meters all the way up to the marathoners, who of you struggles most with feeling kind of sick to your stomach after you finish a workout? And it would always be those athletes who do those 400 to 800 meter type training sessions. So we had to do a lot of work on intentional recovery, even when your body might be saying, I don't think I need this. And let's be clear, if you're listening to this and you run 3 times a week, 5K a time, then don't overthink your recovery. Just eat
Yeah.
your next meal. If you want to go to bed that night and eat your breakfast in the morning, that's fine. This is targeted for people who are doing this on back-to-back days, like you said, especially in the evening or with some intensity, and they know they need to recover because their body's breaking down. So what I recommend in those situations, whether it's the evening or not, where you need to refuel, but you're not sure if you can find the time or the appetite to do it, is that we still want to get protein for
Mm-hmm.
that muscle repair, and the muscle's primed for it right after training. It's really going to do real good work if you get that protein in fairly quickly. Usually we say within the first 2 hours after the workout. Some might say 15 to 30 minutes is optimal. I mean, you're really splitting hairs at that point, but let's say within 2 hours. And you really do want to get that carb in there too. Okay. So how
Okay.
do we go about doing that? So obviously you can do like a meal, if you want to sit down and eat a air quotes meat and potatoes meal, whether that's some salmon and sweet potato or some chicken and rice, or, with some broccoli and salad, like that's absolutely fine. But the point of our discussion here is, what if you're not feeling hungry, or if you're rushing, it's the
Yeah.
morning, and you've just finished your run and you got to go. So then we get into foods that might be a bit more efficient at getting the
Mm-hmm.
protein and the carbs. The protein in this case, the examples I gave you being the meat proteins. Then I love to go to things like Greek yogurt.
Mm-hmm.
Really efficient, very high in protein. I do want to mention I have a partnership with Oikos Pro, which it's a Greek yogurt brand that I've been recommending my entire career. And I started
Yeah.
recommending it a lot because I had chefs I work with who said, Jen, just so you know, this is the best tasting Greek yogurt on the market. They
Wow.
said, of all the ones out there, they said this is the one that they all use in their kitchens. So I've always recommended that one as sort of like, they've all got a lot of protein, but this one's going to taste the best. And now they have a series of high protein yogurts, Greek yogurts, that are out on the market that give us somewhere between 18 and 24 grams of protein per serving. The target amount of protein that we want to get is somewhere in that range of about, say, 20 grams of protein per meal. So if you want to make yourself a smoothie, or actually use a Greek yogurt drink, which are now available, and use that as your foundation, what I love about that is you add your fruit to that, your banana, maybe some oatmeal or dry oats. You throw that in the blender and off you go. Mango, you can have a lot of fun with it. Spinach, and you're gone. But what people don't realize is there's enough protein in there. You don't need protein powder. Because
Yeah.
people always say, oh, do I have to use a protein shake? And I said, no, you can do this through whole foods. And that's the
Wow.
best thing, is if we can use natural foods for that. So those are just a few ideas. I'm happy to give more, but at least that gives you a start on how we would go about that recovery process, even if we can't eat food because it's going to make our stomach upset. Is try to find something liquid, something easy to drink.
Yeah, something you can kind of consume or sip at gradually for the next couple of hours instead of force
Bingo.
feeding yourself for 20 minutes. I've certainly been there myself. You talk about different types of protein, dairy-based, like in Greek yogurt. You talked about fish and meat. Are there specific proteins that are better or worse for recovery that athletes or people training generally should be targeting?
Yeah, so the examples that I just gave you definitely did skew towards the animal-based sources. And I want to give full credit out there that you can use plant-based sources as well.
Mm-hmm.
There's lots of options on the plant-based side that are rich in protein, whether that's tofu, whether that's beans. We can use things like nuts and seeds and peanut butter and almond butter. Where it gets a bit sticky is that it's a little bit more efficient to get your protein from animal sources.
Right.
Getting that sort of magic 20 grams of protein or more per meal, you'd have to be eating something on the order of 7 tablespoons of peanut butter in order to get that.
Yeah.
The other thing is that the protein sources from those plant-based foods are not what we would call complete, which means they don't have all of the essential amino acids, which are the building blocks of protein in them. Whereas the animal sources are. Now, let's be entirely fair here. If you're going to split hairs and say, does the research show without a shadow of a doubt that you have to consume animal protein all the time to be at your best? No, there's lots of evidence to say people who consume plant-based diets can do just fine and recover really, really well. It just requires more planning. You have to be more attentive to your protein. You have to be more aware of making sure you get a variety of plant-based sources so you get all those essential amino acids wrapped up in different plant-based foods. So both paths can get you still to Rome.
Okay.
One of them just requires a little bit more time and attention. So it's up to the individual, and that's when a good dietitian will help you customize.
Talking about time and attention, you've already touched on it a little bit, and I'm hoping we can delve a little bit deeper into the topic of whole foods versus, I'll call them, nutritional supplements. You mentioned in some of those tips that you were giving, particularly around making a smoothie, that you can actually get enough protein without having to resort to a protein powder, something that you're buying off the shelf and dumping into a blender along with all the other ingredients. Where is the place for those nutritional supplements, if any? Are you someone who really advocates for whole foods first and supplements as a last resort, or is there a blend that can be kind of struck as a balance between the two?
So I'm not anti-supplement. I'm definitely not. It's part of my job. If you're going to work with people at the cutting edge of sport who, again, are chasing podiums and records or championships, you have to be open-minded to supplements because they can provide an edge. And there's some supplements that can provide things that no food can't. So, a good example of that's on the market that's gotten a lot of attention these days is creatine. Creatine is a supplement that's traditionally it was used for building muscle and for speed and power based sports. But now there's all this emerging evidence around cognitive function. And, if you've had a bad night of sleep, taking a high dose of creatine to help you sort of boost your cognitive performance and energy for that particular day, concussion management, things like that. So my job is to be aware of those trends and then provide advice that's safe and effective so that we're not just going, oh, here's 27 random supplements. Hopefully one of them helps. And then on top of that, we want to make sure that anything that we're giving an athlete is not increasing any risk of a doping infraction. So anybody who's in the doping pool, but even athletes who aren't, they don't want to accidentally take something with a steroid in it or, with some type of tainted, even if it's things like heavy metals and things like that nobody's wanting to, increase their risk of toxicity from consuming too much aluminum or cadmium. So we want to make sure the supplements that we give people have an intention behind them, that there's a role that it's playing in your training or your recovery, and that it's safe, and that you're taking it the right way. You're taking it at the right times, in the right dose, and maybe not all the time.
Right.
Sometimes the best part of taking a supplement is to not take it for a period of time so that you can give your body a break, and then you sort of pulse it into your training for a block for a period of time that really gives you a real bang for your buck. So those, I think like I said, those discussions, ironically, when I've had them with a lot of national team athletes, they've actually sometimes been reluctant. I've been the one who's had to drive the car a bit, so to speak, because they say, oh, I've been told all supplements are bad. I shouldn't take them. And I'm the one saying, actually, this one could raise your performance by 1% to 2%. And when we're talking about an Olympic final, 1% to 2% is massive.
Yeah, that's huge.
But for the person who's listening here, who's running 3 times a week, 5K, I don't think that there's going to be much need to take a supplement like, say, beta-alanine, which is great for helping reduce that lactate that we talked about before, buffering against that acidity in the muscle. We use that for somebody who really needs it at the upper echelons of the sport.
Are there certain foods that you're a big believer in for just general day-to-day performance? And I know that this is a huge sweeping question, but for those athletes who find themselves somewhere further down the spectrum from Olympic finalist level, maybe they don't want to be taking supplements, or maybe they just want to be incorporating really great nutrition into the meals that they're already cooking. Are there certain things that you point to, and I'll use maybe the example of endurance sport for us to narrow down a little bit, of go-tos that you think are both easy to incorporate, tasty enough that people want to incorporate them, and replicable enough that people are going to want to continue coming back to them?
Sure. Yeah, great question.
On a weekly or a daily basis.
Realistic stuff. Yeah. What's realistic? There's so many superfoods out there. It's like, how much bee pollen can I consume? It's like, well,
Exactly.
Take it back a little bit here, and food's getting very expensive too. So we need to look at things that are efficient for us, for our pocketbooks as well.
Totally.
So especially if you're buying your new latest, carbon shoe, we got that money for that. So, anyway, so where I would start with, let's go back to those protein foods. Now, I make a bit of a controversial statement here in some people's eyes. So if we talk about the meat proteins, I'm a biggest fan of fish and red meat, believe it or not. And the reason for that is fish is really rich in the omega-3s and red meat's really rich in iron. This is nothing against chicken and white meats. They're great. The issue is that they are not as rich in either of the nutrients I just mentioned. There's not a lot in there. in the chicken and the turkey family that's sort of really powerful, other than the protein that it contains. If you love
Right.
them, keep eating them. People worry about the red meat, and I tell them, look, you have to look at it in the greater context of your diet.
Hmm.
But for women in particular, that iron in that red meat is incredibly powerful for maintaining iron status, which for endurance athletes is a real issue.
Hmm.
Endurance athletes are more likely to have low iron because of the running, the actual striking of your foot on the ground. We call it foot strike hemolysis, and it raises the risk of iron deficiency in both male and female endurance runners specifically. So that's why I say red meat. People say how often? Well, with the fish, I say at least 2, preferably 3 times a week. The red meat, I would say the same thing. But if it's 4 for each of those, I wouldn't sweat it. So I
Wow.
start there. I'm a huge fan of eggs. They're great, especially for breakfast. They're so efficient. They give you a nice dose of protein as well, and they taste good, and they're incredibly versatile. We
Yeah.
love making like a crustless quiche at home with a bunch of veggies in there, and then that's something that can be dinner a bunch of different times. Super simple, and we warm it up. I've mentioned before, but I want to mention again, Greek yogurt and foods in that dairy family. Cottage cheese is incredibly rich in protein. It's a fun one to play around with, especially some people like it before bed. But Greek yogurt, and I mentioned before, Oikos Pro as a really simple alternative amongst the Greek yogurt family that you can use, whether it's with berries or granola or throwing it in a smoothie. But you can also use it as a substitute for anything that would have had sour cream in it.
Hmm.
So you can, it in its plain form, maybe not strawberry or flavored, but you can play around with it in a lot of like Mexican dishes. I've actually baked with it and made muffins with it before.
Wow.
So there's, in Greek dishes, you can go in all sorts of directions there. So those are sort of your staple proteins that I would keep in the cupboard. I
Hmm.
definitely would still include, even though they're not as high in protein, some nuts, especially things like almonds, really rich in antioxidants, or almond butter. But all nuts, they all have value, and seeds. I love hemp seeds because they're really high in protein as well, and very rich in magnesium. And that's great for relaxing your muscles before you go to sleep at night. So I use hemp seeds in my oatmeal and on salads, sometimes it's smoothies.
Wow.
And then on the carb side, I'd really make sure to hit those sweet potatoes because they're so rich in both the carbs, but the fiber and also potassium,
Mm.
which is great for keeping the muscles working properly. And then beyond that, quinoa, I mean, it's a home run. It's a incredibly nutrition, like sort of a superfood chocked full of nutrients. And then any carb beyond that, you know what the last one I'll mention actually in the carb family that gets so underappreciated, and I want to give it some love, is the potato. Potatoes are
The
actually
humble potato.
the humble potato is so nutritious, and especially with the skin on. So and I think for runners, it's a great staple food. So that's about 9 or 10 foods there. If you start there, throw in some spinach, throw in some avocados, and of course your berries and fruit. You've got the foundations for pretty much everything you need, and all of those foods can be jumbled together into different combinations. If you are smart, you buy things frozen to save a few bucks. So there's lots of ways that we can make this financially efficient for you. And then you have the building blocks of everything you need, and it doesn't have to cost a ton.
That's such great advice to have. It's making me a little bit hungry even just
Right.
listening. In my household, we were big fans of the mashed potatoes with the skins on, with the Greek yogurt mixed in. You're getting a little bit of that protein
Do
hit
you
on top
really?
of the. Yeah, it's a popular one. A good Irish boy like me knows how to cook up some mashed potatoes, and we
You know
always
what?
substitute sour cream for Greek yogurt anyway. So nice to know
I
that
love
I'm
that.
on the right path.
I
Um,
love doing sweet potatoes cut in half, baked, and then you put stuff in it, like you stuff it. So
yeah,
I stuff it with like black beans, Greek yogurt, and then I make like a mini guacamole sort of that goes on top of it, and that can actually be the whole meal. Like
wow.
it can be the entire
Yeah,
thing,
you're
and you put
ticking all
different
the boxes
seasonings.
there. Carbs,
Yeah, yeah, and it's like a one dish
protein.
meal with no mess at all. It's great. Yeah.
Wow. I feel like we could talk about recipe ideas all day. I
I'm
want to
hungry.
shift gears a little bit towards race day performance, where
Okay, great.
maybe it's a little bit tougher to eat half of a sweet potato with black beans on top. You might be reaching more often for a piece of toast with a banana and some peanut butter. But it all comes back to that same idea of what is the balance between getting our fueling, getting our recovery even on race day from whole foods, from natural foods, versus the role of things like sports drinks or gels or
Yes.
all of the pre and during race fueling options that are out there. Again, there's such a dizzying array available. And even as a professional runner, I still look at a shelf full of different gels and get a little bit overwhelmed about, okay, do I need these? Are there certain
Yeah.
ones that I should be taking? For our athletes who are doing those longer endurance events, what are some tips that they can bring with them to race day? We've talked a lot about how they can really fuel their build, fuel their training on a daily and a weekly basis. But when they're trying to squeeze that maximum performance out of themselves a couple of times a year, what would someone in your position as a registered dietitian offer as some advice to them for performance?
Such a great question, and you touched on something so important there, which is you said, we're hitting on all these whole foods, these really, single ingredient foods that are so nutrient dense. And this is where I sometimes throw people off, because I just say we get to race day and I'm like, we kind of got to throw all that out the window. And that's not because we don't love and appreciate the value that whole foods can give us, but because they are harder to digest, and that's a good thing. And not harder in a way that's destructive to your body, but harder in the sense that the foods that we've been talking about so far have been rich in things like protein and fiber or healthy fats. And all of those things make things slower to digest, which is usually helpful because it keeps us feeling satisfied.
Yeah.
The issue is on race day, we don't want to feel overfull. And I've done that. I've made that mistake where I'm on the start line. I remember a time, actually, I ran a 10K years ago, and I ate a bowl of chili the night before because I went to a fast food restaurant and I was like, oh, I'm going to be the holier than thou dietitian. I'm not going to eat the burger. It was the
Yeah.
only thing open. And we just gotten into town and the race was the next morning. So I was like, I won't eat the burger. I'm going to eat the chili. Well, all that fiber from those beans, I mean, that sits there, my friend.
Yeah.
And plus the heat and the spices and so on. And you get on that start line the next morning, you're like, that chili is still with me.
Yeah.
And
Not
you're
a feeling
preparing.
anyone who's been on the start line wants to ever feel.
No, and you're like, someone is going to tell a story about me to their friends 15 years from now about
Yeah.
the woman at the race. So you don't want that. We don't want that.
No.
We want simple. We want to keep really straightforward. So race day really starts arguably 3 days before the race, give or take, depending on your digestive system. And what we mean by that is you want to start, I would call like lightening up your foods a few days before. What do I mean by that? That is when we might start diminishing those really intense high fiber foods, those heavy foods, those spicy foods. We definitely want to skew, if we're doing a longer endurance event or we're racing to win, towards more carbohydrates. Getting into that whole debate about how we go about increasing carbs, or, do we want to do something in that vein? It definitely is a source of great controversy. I don't think we want to go too deep into those weeds right now, but nevertheless, carbs are going to be what's going to fuel us up for race day. So don't exclude them. Let's say that. At minimum, eat what you've normally been eating. And for some people, they might want to increase a little bit. So we go through our day, we make sure we're eating our carb foods regularly. Let's still eat our proteins in those days before, but
Right.
let's make sure that they're on the lighter side. So this might not be when we eat the red meat that I suggested before. We might go
Gotcha.
with our fish, our chicken, our Greek yogurt, and our eggs as our proteins, or our tofu if we're going plant-based. They're just a little easier to digest.
Mm-hmm.
Then we get to the night before. I really like people having a snack before they go to bed. And the reason
Okay.
for that is the morning is unpredictable. You might wake up and be like, oh my God, I can't possibly eat anything, or I can't eat much. And you just don't know where that's going to go for you. So better to fuel up the night before. What you do with that is the food you ate those 3, 2, and 1 days before, that is going to help increase the liver, the glycogen in the muscle, and top that up. The food you eat the night before increases your liver glycogen, which is something people don't talk about a lot, but
No.
that's the carb that's in your liver that helps regulate your blood sugar throughout the day. So that will be called on the next day during the race, especially if it's long or intense, as a backup source of fuel, especially if glycogen in the muscle is getting low or blood sugar is starting to drop. So that bedtime, what I love is like a bowl of cereal is a great one, with some cow's milk, or it might be a yogurt granola parfait, something like that. It just needs to be really simple, a smoothie and small, nothing that's going to cause you to be awake all night because you overate.
Wow.
Okay. So then we go into morning of, and then we want to go very light, very low fiber, carb-based foods. So toast, you mentioned that, or pieces of a bagel, however much you can tolerate. I do a little bit of oatmeal that has a bit of fiber in it, so that's a bit of a dance. I definitely find that the nerves play on my mind, and I'm sometimes like I'm choking it down a little bit. So oatmeal is about as high on that realm. You could do a very low fiber cereal if you wanted to. Any of those would work. The key is you have to have tried it in training. Do
Right.
not try this food for the first time on race day. You need to know how long and how much you can eat before you actually get on that line where it feels you don't feel hungry, but you certainly aren't still digesting and tasting it. So I would say somewhere between, 90 minutes to 3 hours before race time is a good time to eat, but you're going to customize that for yourself. And then as much carb as you can sort of tolerate, if you can
Mm-hmm.
manage to get a couple pieces of toast, and I didn't mention bananas, but they're a great one. With some peanut butter on them and a banana, great. If all you can do is half a piece of toast and half a banana, then so be it. And I'll finish by touching on the actual fueling in the race because you mentioned about the gels. So gels are certainly an option. What are they? Pure concentrated sugar. They're
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
basically, some of them taste like icing sugar you'd have on a cake or icing you'd put on a cake. And it's just meant to be an ultra quick 25-gram serving of carbs, which is basically the equivalent of a slice of bread or a banana.
Mm-hmm.
Usually for most runners, they're sort of in the mid range of the pack. They'd want to get maybe two of those an hour if they're in a marathon. So that'd be about 50 grams of carbs per hour. The elites now are aiming for 100 grams of carbs per hour. But this is important. Hear me. If you just heard me throw that away and you go, oh, I'm going to start eating 100 grams of carbs per hour. You must train your digestive system to adapt to that. You cannot go out in this weekend's long run and hit 4 gels an hour during a 30K training session.
Mm-hmm.
It's going to be a disaster. You're going to be on the sideline going to the bathroom or throwing up. Okay. So that has to be built up over you actually have to build receptors in your digestive system. That takes weeks to months. So start at 1 gel an hour, work up to 2. And if you're someone chasing, elite success, 3 and then maybe 4, but you can use sports drinks if you wish. You can use bananas, you can use, baby cookies, pretzels. There's a lot of different options. There's
Mm-hmm.
gummies, old fashioned gummy bears. They all will do the trick. The key is simple carbs that you can digest well.
Yeah. So really just it's not so much the food itself as it is just recognizing, okay, when I'm in the middle of this hard training or racing for that matter, my body just needs quick carbs. It needs sugars, plain and simple. I think a lot of people shy away. They're shocked to learn that elite athletes, elite marathoners are chugging flat Coke or eating, like you say, gummy bears are they're prolific within elite marathoning circles. And I think people are shocked that in their minds they assume they're these monks eating salads all day long. But so much of fueling is giving your body what it needs right in the moment, from what I understand. And based on my personal experience, sometimes it's just a lot easier when you're in the middle of something very hard to just wolf down those quick sugars. You're not craving a full meal, nor is that practical. And I think that, yeah, you do a beautiful job of laying out that ultimately to maximize performance, we don't want to be slurping down gels instead of meals on a daily basis every single day, but they do serve a purpose. And those quick carbohydrates, the white bread in the morning of a race, it does serve a purpose. I want to flip it back to you now, Jen, and just open the floor to talk about anything that's been of particular interest to you in the world of sports nutrition, whether that's trends that you've seen be taken up right now that you have a stance on, or things that you're doing in your own research or work with athletes that has been particularly interesting lately. What are some of the things that are most exciting to you right now in the world of sports nutrition?
Well, there's a lot. That's like a whole other podcast. But
Yeah.
the ones that I know I touched on creatine before. That's like, all over the headlines right now. And I think it's fun to watch that area. It's fun to watch women start taking creatine.
Mm,
There's been so much stigma around it because there's this perception that it causes weight gain. So I've had, countless women approach me recently, sort of like almost like whispering. They're like, should I try and take creatine? And like, yeah, you can try it. And, maybe you don't do a full dose. Maybe you start with a 2.5-gram dose, which is a half a serving, and you take it regularly and you see how your body feels and your mind feels. Cool. So the creatine area I think is super fun. There's been some interesting research on protein that's been really fascinating where a research group, really well regarded research group out of Europe, looked at giving a large dose of protein in recovery instead of sort of that 20 grams that we've been talking about for the last 10 or 15 years, but doing
hmm
more like 100 grams of protein all at once, and
Wow.
then not eating for like a 12-hour period after that, and looking at the body's ability to build muscle. And it actually looks like you still can very nicely after eating that huge dose of protein rather than the incremental lower doses. It's only one study, so it's one that's generated a lot of conversation, but we need some follow-up research. But what I think it's going to potentially open the door for is real customization of meal timing, especially for people who are interested in fasting, intermittent fasting or time restricted feeding protocols, where they say, well, Jen, I like how I feel when I maybe, stop eating at 7 at night and maybe I don't eat until 11 a.m. the next morning, a 16-hour fast or so. I feel like I feel a little bit better. My digestive system works better. Some people, especially when they're getting a little older, use it for metabolic health, meaning reducing their risk of certain cardiovascular disease or type 2 diabetes. And they feel that it's helpful for that. And I want to be clear, the research is all little here and there, but there are some people who it really works for them. So the idea that maybe we could dose them with what we call a big bolus of protein in their last meal of the day and know that they're still able to sort of preserve some muscle mass through the morning, which is one of the biggest problems with going into an intermittent fasting protocol, is that you're missing those opportunities to get those nutrients you need. So this might be a new way for people to be able to explore that avenue of eating. And then the last thing I'll say that I think is, it's not maybe a new trend, but it is where my research lies. And one of the things I am doing is my PhD research is looking at the impact of chronic underfueling, which leads to a condition that I'm sure you've heard of called REDS, or relative energy deficiency in sport. It's a term that's been out there for about 11 years now. And in the running community, they've really sort of taken it up and started to understand what this condition is. But it's basically a syndrome or constellation of symptoms that are observed in athletes, both female or male, after a prolonged or intense period of what we call low energy availability, which is where you don't have enough calories coming in to support the training or the load that you're doing in your sport and all your basic physiological functioning. And then we start to see performance decline and health decline. And for me, this area is so important because there's so much messaging and it's still out there on social media. And I'm seeing this in women, especially who are going through perimenopause and menopause. All the messaging is you got to eat less and you got to eat fewer carbs. And they end up in this low energy availability state because they're being so restrictive and so afraid of gaining some weight, or so afraid of, whatever it might be, carrying a few extra pounds when they're running, that they end up really harming their health by thinking that they're helping themselves. And again, the social media content out there is brutal for this. So helping athletes, male and female, to understand how important it is for them to fuel regularly and consistently, and how much they'll benefit by being stronger. And we've done so much work with our Canadian athletes, and some of the women in particular, helping them to carry 2, 3, 4, 5 more pounds when they're running. And it ends up being pure lean mass, and they become so strong and so resilient rather than trying to chase being, stick thin and ultra light and ending up with a million injuries and constant sickness, and then feeling terrible and losing their season because of that. So those are probably the 3 areas that are sort of the hot topics of the day. What are your thoughts? What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I love that you bring Red S into that, and we could do an entire episode, and maybe one day we will. I hope that we get the opportunity to talk more about that, but it is just refreshing to hear the perspective of someone who's spent their whole life working in elite sport and is debunking what we see on social media, what we see so often in accounts of high performance, or just the public's general perception of what it takes to be high performance. And it doesn't mean foregoing food in favor of supplements. It doesn't mean trying to be as lean or as light as possible. And Jen, I'm just so appreciative that you've taken the time to share with us some of the really applicable ways that athletes at every level of the sport can take steps towards maximizing performance and also just being the healthiest, most robust version of themselves. Jen, thank you so much for taking the time out of your day. Very best of luck working with all of our athletes in the coming track and field season, and we'll look forward to chatting with you again very soon, I hope.
Thanks, John. I really enjoyed this. It was so good to see you.
Thanks again to Jen for contributing to this week's episode. Jennifer Sygo is a registered dietitian completing her PhD in sport and exercise medicine at Manchester Metropolitan University. You can look for her research on the impact of fueling and underfueling in high-performance sport in leading sports medicine journals. Her book, Unmasking Superfoods, is available on Amazon.ca. You can follow us on Instagram, Facebook, and X at Shakeout Podcast. If you're enjoying the Shakeout Podcast, please subscribe to the show and consider leaving us a review. Thanks for joining us this week, and we'll see you next time for your weekly Shakeout.